podcast. My name is Nancy Odimego. We're back with something really interesting, an assessment of oil producing states in Nigeria. Now that is our focus for today's discussion. And I'm not alone. We have serious minds joining us in this podcast. Extractive lead for budget in the person of engineer Adejoke Akimbode. Hi Joke, nice to have you join us.
Nancy.
And Joke is not alone actually. We also have a senior research and policy analyst, Iniobong Usen. Ini, what's up?
Hello, Nancy.
Hi.
Feels good to be here.
Thank you for joining us. So, by the way, guys, Ini recently featured in IBP's Budget Trailblazer. It's an amazing interview, and you can check it out. It's up on their website. So, let's just delve in without wasting much of our time. I mean, 2020 was a crazy year, if I'm to say. The pandemic and everything put together, no sector was spared. So that's where we are going to start from. And Ini, I hope you don't mind. You know they say ladies first. So we are going to be starting with
By all means,
Joke here. We are going to be starting with Joke. So Joke, let's come to you now. 2020 came, the pandemic came, the COVID-19 it came, and it had its impact. Especially it affected oil prices. I mean, so let's have an overview. The impact of falling oil prices now due to COVID on the revenue of oil producing states and the effect it had on the revenue targets as well as any budget cuts.
Yeah, thank you, Nancy. As we all know, the COVID-19 pandemic actually exposed the inherent economic vulnerabilities of the states in Nigeria, even as Nigeria as a country, and it was really a sad thing to see the federal government and some states actually cutting down their budgets, not once, not twice, some twice, and that's because oil price crashed and they couldn't meet their FAAC allocation to give states. So even states cannot even rely on their IGR. And another effect that COVID-19 had was that most of the little revenue they got last year was actually spent on recurrent expenditure. And most states could not even do any capital projects. So it's actually a sad thing that without oil, Nigeria as a whole can actually not function, and this is a time that Nigeria and states need to start looking for means of actually getting revenue beyond oil, because we all know that oil revenue now contributes like 70% to the federal government's revenue, and it's high time we look beyond oil and see how can we actually survive without oil, because what happened last year might happen again. Then what happened last year keep repeating itself. So it was really sad to see that states, especially oil-producing states, couldn't even function without this, without oil revenue, without the normal FAAC allocation they get, despite that they still get 13% derivation from the federal government. Yes. So yeah, it's really sad. So there was really a lot of a lot of setback for the states last year to function properly in terms of their revenue.
Wow, that's so sad. So if we're to look at the FAAC now and the 13% derivative as well as the IGR, now let's move this over to Ines' side, with reference to budget policy documents on assessing the impact of low oil price environments on state fiscal sustainability. Now most of the oil producing states, they have reliance, over 50% reliance on the federal allocation and the 13% derivative. For example, now Bayelsa between 2015 and 2019, I mean their reliance on this derivative was shooting close to 90%. So if you're looking at this, how sustainable now is this, considering the dwindling revenue? Each time it keeps dropping due to the crashing oil prices.
Yeah, so going by an assessment budget does, which is the state of states.
Yes.
Looking at the fiscal assessment of sustainability of states and how states can generate revenues internally to fund their budgets. In the last 3 years, if you look at the last 3 assessments budget has done, a lot of states are not fiscally viable. And we sort of have metrics for measuring the fiscal sustainability of states. So we look at how states are able to fund their recurrent expenditure with their recurrent revenue. We look at how states are able to meet their debt liabilities or their debt obligations with their revenue. And like you rightly pointed out, between 2015 and 2019, the 4 states under review in this document we're reviewing today had, say for River State, their dependency on FAAC, which is a summation of the allocation from the statutory allocation from the federal government and the 13% derivation, was close to 90%. Bayelsa was 90%. Akwa Ibom was about 87%.
Okay.
Delta 76%. It was just Rivers that was about 55%.
Yes.
What that tells you is that for a state like Bayelsa that was 90%, only 10% of what contributed to their total recurrent revenue was generated internally, was gotten either from the 13% derivation and statutory allocation from the federal government.
Okay.
Why is that worrisome? So 50% of the revenue that accrues to the federal government is from gotten from proceeds of oil.
Okay.
Over 90% of our foreign exchange revenues are also gotten from, the proceeds of oil. So if you are confronted with a situation like we were last year, where the global demand for crude, plummeted to levels, we've almost never experienced before, right? And you are confronted with prices almost, in the negative, or in some point in April last year, West Texas Intermediate, which is also a blend of crude, went for below $37 per barrel. And if you are looking at the production cost of $28 to $30 per barrel, and that same product you are selling it at negative $37 per barrel, what that tells you is that at some point, a lot of these companies and because the government is a major player in the industry, we're actually borrowing, or funding some of their production costs with debt. So that tells you that in the short, medium, and even the long term, over-reliance on revenues from oil is not sustainable, especially if you look at the fact that the world is trying to transition away from the dependence on fossil fuel. Countries like the UK have, put a plan in place to phase out petrol-powered vehicles by 2030. So what does that do for the demand for petrol in countries like that? And that policy is, trickling down across the West. There are countries like Norway that have plans to phase out emissions of greenhouse gases, especially from carbon, like you would find in petrol. So with regimes like that in the near, to the not too distant future, you would expect that countries that are over reliant on oil and have not been able to diversify their economy and streams of income would actually be dealt a very big blow. Like Joker said earlier, a lot of the states needed some form of bailout last year to be able to run government effectively, which is the recurrent expenditure. But more importantly, the revenues were not even there to invest in capital projects which are supposed to impact, the development of the state, both in the medium and in the long term. So without adequate or constructive plans to actually diversify the economy of the states, right, and continuous over reliance on oil, these states in the not too distant future might not even be able to take care of their recurrent expenditure, talk less of the capital expenditure. And if you even look at the debt structure of the states, so that tells you that if you are running a foreign exchange regime like we are doing now, where you have the exchange rate almost at 500 naira, and you have a huge external debt, what it will mean is that you will need more naira to buy more dollars to pay your debt. And you don't need to have a PhD to know that is not sustainable in the long run.
So speaking about performance now of the 4 oil producing states, Delta, Bayelsa, Akwa Ibom, and Rivers, how would you rate the performance of these states now in terms of IGR, and what are the things that constitute the IGR?
So the IGR, what would usually make up the IGR are your payee, which is pay as you earn, direct assessments. Now those two forms of taxes are from the personal income tax. Your payee is what is personal income tax you would get from somebody that is in a paid job and that is employed, right?
8 to 5.
Exactly. While the direct assessments are, are like the taxes you would get from the self-employed persons. Then you have other taxes. So like in Lagos State, you have your consumption tax, you have your hotel occupancy tax and all of that. You have your land, I think it's tenement rate.
Yes.
So all of that, and so many others that, I cannot really mention at the moment, are things that would make up your other taxes. Then you have your road taxes. So all the kekes, the buses, all of that is supposed to make up your road taxes. Then you now have your revenues from the MDAs. So each of those MDAs, as the ministries, departments, agencies of government, are supposed to generate revenues depending on their mandates. So like the Ministry of Transport, for instance, might have certain revenues that are supposed to accrue to them, maybe as levies, rents, and all of that. Same applies for maybe the Ministry of Finance, Ministry of Lands, and all of that. So a lot of these MDAs have been given mandates to generate revenues based on the services they offer to citizens. But what we have seen, especially with the oil producing states, and I don't know if I think it's also linked to the over reliance on revenue from oil. We've seen that the road taxes, the MDA revenues are not commensurate with the workforce and even the population. So if you have a state like Akwa Ibom that has a population of about 6 million, and you are doing road taxes of less than 500 million, what that tells us is that you are not maximizing or optimizing, your revenue streams. You are not, working really hard to mobilize revenues to be able to effectively fund your budget. What we see in a lot of these states is that they outsource the collection of a lot of these, say for the payee and maybe the MDA revenues. The other taxes and the road taxes sometimes are outsourced to what do you call them, consultants.
Okay.
And when you have a system where there's no centralized mode of collecting taxes, it provides an opportunity for corruption. There's a lot of leakages in the system. So you find a situation where if like 100 million naira is generated in taxes, maybe more than 70% of that sum would find its way into private pockets.
Yeah.
And for the MDA revenues as well, because the states have not been able to operationalize their treasury single account. So that treasury single account is supposed to be like a single account where all the government revenues are supposed to accrue to. But the situation you find in a lot of these states is that each of the MDAs have several accounts. So they have accounts that are just lying fallow with funds sitting in them. Yeah. But if we had a situation where there was a functioning treasury single account, whatever payments were supposed to accrue to government, maybe if you are going to go and pay maybe for a levy or maybe like a permit, for instance, that is supposed to accrue to the state, there is one central account where all those payments are paid into. That will ensure that there's some form of monitoring and coordination of the resources that are supposed to accrue to the states from the MDAs. So what we see is that among those 4 states that we had reviewed in that report, it was only Bayelsa, that had been able to operationalize their TAC to a certain extent. So in 2019, when the assessment was done by the World Bank, about 50% of the revenues from MDAs that are supposed to accrue to Bayelsa State were domiciled in the TSA account. But for the other 3 states, Akwa Ibom, Rivers, Delta, they have no, as at the last assessment, they have no functioning treasury single account. They still operate multiple accounts. A state like Akwa Ibom has over 150 accounts operated by the MDAs. If you have accounts like that all over the place, there's practically no way the government can mop up all of the revenues that is supposed to accrue to it. And you need these revenues to effectively implement your budget, carry out your plans and programs, as domiciled in your policy document.
So with all the numerous accounts, the multiple accounts going here and there, how would you say the performances of these oil producing states are? Where is it right now?
They are extremely low. Say for the payee, the road taxes, the other taxes, the MDA revenues are extremely low. If you look at the direct assessment, which is supposed to be the personal income tax from self-employed persons, is extremely low, and that's a pointer to the fact that these governments have not been able to properly capture all of the citizens that are supposed to be within the tax bracket. So there are a lot of Nigerians that do not pay taxes, right? And even if they do, like if you look at the informal sector, for instance, if you look at maybe market women that have tabletop businesses, all of those 200 naira, 100 naira, 500 naira they pay daily to these tax collectors don't make their way into the public purse, right? All of these monies go into private pockets, right? So the government has not been able to fully capture all of the potential tax-paying citizens in the tax bracket. If you're able to do that effectively, then you would expect that from direct taxes alone, you will see some considerable improvement. And the same goes also for the road taxes, right? You still have a lot of these boys collecting a lot of these taxes.
Yes.
The same goes for the MDA revenues. If you're not able to operationalize your treasury single account, make it such that all the revenues that the MDAs generate go into a single account, you will still find these leakages occurring.
Okay, so before we go over to Adejoke, you earlier mentioned debt. The implication of debt, truth be told, is that it crowds out revenue that's supposed to be channeled now towards development.
True.
Now, some of the biggest oil-producing states in Nigeria are also among the highest indebted states. Now, what's the irony? So, if you consider the future of government, the future of oil, rather here, what are the alternative ways that these governments can use to raise additional revenue, so that they could at least accelerate their IGR?
So, the easiest way out now, right, is these states need to look at how they can mobilize resources, revenues domestically.
Okay.
They have to partake in ventures that would significantly boost their IGR. What does that entail? So we've spoken about the road taxes, right? There should be they should sort of digitize their tax system, prevent cash payments in this day and age, where we're operating a cashless policy.
Yeah.
People should not be paying taxes by cash. The moment you allow people to have contact with cash, you would expect that some form of corruption would happen. They also need to harmonize and centralize their tax system. So all of the different consultants that you have collecting taxes in different places have to be brought together, and you need to have that tax system in one place. We visited Kaduna State last year, and we were so impressed with what was happening or what is happening in Kaduna State.
Okay.
The chairman of the Internal Revenue Service in Kaduna State practically sits in his office and has like a dashboard that shows him by the minute how much comes in from
a digital dashboard.
Dashboard. So if you are Nancy, a paper seller in let's say Mushi Market, for instance, if you pay a tax of let me 200 naira for that day, the chairman can see that transaction in his office.
Uploads immediately.
It uploads because it's digital. You are not giving anybody the money.
Okay.
They have been able to. They have pay points where instead of you paying the money to somebody, there's like a semblance of like an agent, like the way this agency banking works.
Yes.
So you pay cash, then they remit it to your tax account, and it just reflects, on the dashboard.
Wow.
If you have a system like that, the states can effectively plan because they know the number of persons, within the tax bracket. They know how much those persons are going to bring in per day, right? And they know exactly what to expect in form of taxes. And the moment people see that, these monies that they are paying are not going to private pockets, they are going to the government, and the government is actually using it to carry out, services that affect them. It will even encourage more people, to sort of pay their tax. Another thing governments need to do, is also to find a way to tax high net worth individuals.
Okay.
If you look at countries like the US, they sort of tax, richer people more than they would poor people to sort of bridge that gap, right? But the situation where you find in Nigeria is that the rich people tend to get away with, tax evasion, tax avoidance,
yes,
right? You see people driving, people are able to park 10 cars in their compounds because there's no tax attached to, living that kind of luxury life. People are able to build. If you go to Maitama, for instance, I know there are even some flats in Ikoyi that for some years now they have been left unoccupied. If you had to pay taxes for those buildings being unoccupied, I'm sure you would have found a way to put people in those buildings. So these are things that these governments need to look at. Then also, if you look at some other streams like consumption tax, for instance, Lagos State has been able to implement the consumption tax, where if you are going to eat maybe like in a high-end restaurant now, there's like a 5%
yes,
tax. I don't know if it's 5 or 10% extra that goes to the government. So if you are able to afford maybe a meal for 10,000-15,000,
yes,
you should be able to afford something extra for the government to use to carry out proper service delivery for citizens. That's that. Then another thing I realized in all of these oil producing states is that money no day, but hotels they full. Hotels they full, money no day, hotels they full. So the government should sort of look for a way to tax that kind of consumption. Because for me, I still see it as luxury, right? Because the bulk of the occupants of those hotels are not visitors.
Yes.
They are citizens that live in the state, but they just want flex life.
Yes,
so if you have the money to pay for a 20k room extra when you have a very comfortable room in your house, you should be willing to pay a little bit more for at least people to access quality education, quality healthcare, and all of that. So those amongst many other things. If you look at agriculture, a lot of these states too have sort of looked away from ventures that they used to be and they used to thrive in before before oil came into being. It's those coastal states that used to be very vibrant fishing communities. All that has gone to the drain. So as a way to generate revenue to sort of make up for the revenue shortfall from the from oil, these states need to prioritize diversifying away from oil into some of these other ventures that we had spoken about earlier.
Well, thank you very much, Ini. So now let's move over to Adejoke, right? Speaking about the 13% derivative, it was introduced as a resource benefit transfer mechanism, to alleviate the living condition of the people in the oil-rich region of Niger Delta. Now, funny enough, before this 13% derivative, there have been several other transfer mechanisms. We have the PTF, the NDBA, and many more, and many others. Yet, all these mechanisms, if at all, they've translated little into development. The region, they still have infrastructural decay till today. They still have things like unemployment. They still have things like underdevelopment and so on. So tell us what exactly is going on. What can be done to ensure that these resource benefit mechanisms translate into commensurate development?
Yeah, thank you. I think the first thing the government needs to do across states, especially the oil producing states, is they need to ensure that money gets to where it's supposed to go to.
Okay.
Right. And one thing we've realized is that most of these states actually develop the urban cities and they leave the rural areas. And at the end of the day, you realize that oil is actually gotten from these rural places, and they don't get to benefit from the resource, the revenue gotten from the oil at the end of the day. So the first thing government needs to do is needs assessment, right? And how they can do that is they can do it in conjunction with the state legislature, the state House of Assembly. They actually need to carry out needs assessment in these communities, because you find out that at times you go to a community and probably maybe government is planning to build an healthcare center for them, whereas maybe it's a school they actually need, right? I've been to a community before in Bayelsa, Polako community, sometimes in 2017, and the only primary school in that community was actually built by the community members themselves. And they don't even have a secondary school, so their children actually trek miles to other communities to go to school. So the first thing government needs to do is needs assessment. What do they actually need in this community? And that's where citizenry budgetary comes into place. You don't just develop budgets and assume, okay, these are the projects you want to do in this community. You need to ask them, what do you need? Because needs is actually more important than wants, So that's the first thing government needs to do. And they actually need to block loopholes and leakages in their revenue spendings as well. Because at the end of the day, the revenue might be small, but you can still achieve a lot with that small revenue.
If utilized.
Yes, exactly. So that's one thing government needs to do, because most of these oil producing communities do not benefit from these revenues at the end of the day. So needs assessment, and make sure that for example, the 13% derivation is actually is meant for these oil producing communities for their own development, but government don't spend it in these communities. I doubt if they even benefit from that special revenue at all. So we also have the money, the NDDC project too as well. And another thing government needs to do is collaborate with probably NDDC, and so that they make sure that they don't repeat projects. Because it's possible you see projects in NDDC budget, you also see that same project in the federal government budget. Then somebody will get there, maybe the first contractor that gets there has already started working, then another, maybe the contractor from NDDC gets there, so they're already working on this thing, and that project, the money meant for that allocation in that budget is gone like that. So they need to make sure that there's no duplication of projects as well. So that's how you can actually manage your revenue at the end of the day.
All right, thank you. That was quite interesting. So now let's take a look at these 4 oil producing states. Really, they cannot effectively fund both expenditure, talking about recurrent and talking about capital, with the revenue that they get, unless they borrow. Now, funny enough, the recurrent items are not going anywhere. That's because they are fixed charges. So unless we have something like a drastic reform, a cut down in overhead or something like that. So how plausible and realistic is the cut on recurrent expenditure? And what other steps can they take, to ensure that CAPEX does not get the short end of the stick?
So generally, the state government needs to cut down their high cost of governance.
Okay.
And when you want to cut down your high cost of governance, it includes both recurrent expenditure and your overhead costs. And because the thing is that states might have to take some drastic step in cutting down their personnel costs and their overheads, because you realize that the bulk of their revenue goes to recurrent and overhead costs at the end of it, and they mainly have little revenue for capital expenditure. Yeah. And the thing is, more than ever, state government, they need to allocate more funds to capital expenditures, because capital projects will, do a lot of things for the states, create more jobs, reduce unemployment in the states. Definitely. So if they don't spend on capital projects, then the state will be stagnant at the end of the day. And you realize that the amount of money governments, even state governments, and even the federal government spend on overhead costs is alarming. It's really, really ridiculous. Because you keep seeing some line items in the federal government's budget, and you be like, what are they using this amount of money for? You see them saying they want to maybe furniture to maybe state government's house every year, some ridiculous amounts of money. And I don't know, we all have houses, and I don't think anybody changes their furniture every year. I don't think so. But you keep seeing these line items in their budget, which I believe that it's not like they actually spend that money on what they wrote. Is just for somebody to get extra funds somewhere. So cut their recurrent expenditure, cut their overhead costs, and increase what they spend on capital projects to reduce unemployment, create more jobs. And also state governments actually need to support private companies too. If there is enough investors in your states, it will also create more jobs. Jobs doesn't necessarily need to come from the government, can come from private people as well. So they need to actually make sure that there is an enabling environment for people to build companies in their states. So this way actually, capital projects, when private enterprises build companies and create more jobs in the states, that's a form of capital project, not coming from the state government but from private individuals as well. And when there's more jobs, that of course you get more pay from your people in the state. So more IGR, your IGR will increase like that.
Definitely, it will increase. So, Ini, do you have anything to add to this in terms of recommendations?
So, what I would just say is the states too need to know that for citizens to freely pay taxes, you need to be seen as being doing the right things. So you are asking citizens to pay more taxes than they would ordinarily do in a very challenging economic time. But at the same time, you are making expenditures in areas you should have no business making such expenditures in. If you look at a lot of these states in question, they have white elephant projects all over the place, right? If you take a state like Akwa Ibom State, for instance, I know I've been referencing Akwa Ibom too much because I have very serious stakes in that state. At this time, a state government should have no business building churches, right? Especially if you look at the fact that there's a huge deficit, infrastructure deficit in the education sector, in the wash sector, in the health sector, right? And you are committing billions of naira to building worship centers or religious halls. If you look at a state like Bayelsa, they share a border with Rivers State and Delta State. Akwa Ibom State too, not too far from Bayelsa, also has an airport. Rivers has an airport, Akwa Ibom has an airport, Delta has an airport, and Bayelsa is in the middle of Rivers and Delta. But they committed hundreds of billions to building an airport. You know, in times where you actually need revenues to bridge the infrastructure gap in other critical sectors of the economy, you still find state budgets where the allocations for cars, some of them call it vehicles for the system, so cars that they buy for their political appointees and all of that, are twice the capital budget for education and health. You see those sort of expenditures. You would see expenditures around governors' donation and gifts running into billions of naira, when very little is allocated to education, health, wash, agriculture, other critical sectors. That's even in allocation. Now in disbursement, if you look at the areas where the government has actually committed resources to, because they can allocate X sum, that doesn't mean that is what to get, to the MDA to spend at the end of the day, because the budget is just an estimate of what you intend to do, right? You would see that the areas where disbursements are really high are areas that do not even benefit the common man, right? These states still have private jets that the governors fly, right? So you cannot continue to enjoy this form of opulence. If you look at the commissioners of these states, they live like kings. So you cannot continue to fund that kind of opulence with state resources and expect citizens to freely, give more to the government to carry out their plans and projects as domiciled in their annual budgets. So the states or the managers of the states governments and the state resources have a lot of belt tightening to do, right? They need to be seen, to be proactive in terms of prioritizing what exactly the state would need for sustainable development. I know we have already discussed, the pathways for generating IGR before. I don't want to drum that or to repeat all of that again.
Okay, thank you very much. That was Iniobong Usen, a senior research and policy analyst with Budget, and we also had engineer Adejoke Akimbode, Budget extractive lead. Thank you so much, guys, for joining us. You guys could keep your conversations going on our social media page. On Twitter, it's Budget NG. On Instagram, it's Budget NG. And on Facebook, it's also Budget NG. Your comments, your observations, and recommendations are highly welcome. My name is Nancy Odumego. Until next time, do have a lovely day.